The Rockefeller China story is America's China story. The first three John D. Rockefellers were engaged with China from the time of the American Civil War. The late David Rockefeller, who was responsible for merging his Chase Manhattan with J.P. Morgan Bank, and who ardently pushed for systematically interlocking trade and political relations between the West and China for decades, presciently discussed China's sense of collective discipline, acute achievements, and future potential. His wasn't merely academic observations, but tactical and strategic ones.
Now to talk about investing in China and his latest venture, Weather Central, here as well. So Evelyn, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I just want to get your views on how things have evolved. Has it become a more open society? Has it become an easier place to do business?
Oh, I think it is, no doubt. I think it's a remarkable country. When you think of what has happened in the last 10 years, let alone 20 years, is an achievement beyond recognition.
I'm Richard Rockefeller. I'm chair of the board of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The sentiments that my grandfather and grandmother and actually other relatives of that generation had for China, very positive feelings for the country, passed through the generations to all of us. So China, in a way, wasn't such an unfamiliar place to us as it might have felt for a lot of Americans.
What sort of a financial deal should Obama be seeking to strike when he travels to China next month?
No, I think this would be the time, because you really need to bring China into the creation of a new world order, financial world order.
So Evelyn, what about the RMB situation? You mentioned a so-called currency problem. I mean, do you see the day in the next 5 years where it's fully convertible and flexible?
Well, you're talking to a person who's quite old. If I'm around in 5 years, I'd like to think that that is the case. I think we've all got to move towards that opportunity, and I think the challenge also is whether we should move towards an international currency.
But they really are issues of the construction of a new world order. That's what this is about. And that's the sort of dialogue the Chinese are generally good at. And so a partnership between us is essential. A conflict between us is going to exhaust us both in tactical exercises that cannot be conclusive.
And the New World Order could satisfy both.
It has to satisfy both, because otherwise it will lead to tensions that will exhaust us both.
One has to give credit to President Nixon's and Henry Kissinger's initiative. They broke the ice. They did. But they confronted a residue of suspicion, and that suspicion was mutual, and grievances. And they were also mutual, that it really took time for the relationship to sort of become more normal, more predictable, and eventually what we accomplished was that it became, in fact, open and full, comprehensive, and in fact initiated a kind of secret collaboration, or even perhaps you could call it an alliance.
Wall Street and China, a long, intimate relationship. The history of Wall Street and Anglo-American finance in China is one that is rarely discussed in Western media or even in academia, whereas knowing it would explain much about both China's stunning economic rise over the past 70 years, as well as certainly seemingly rising tensions between China and the United States today. It's hard to tell if there's genuine tension and enmity because of credible rivalry status between the U.S. and China, or if everything is proceeding according to wider, deeper, much longer-term planning based on desired, durable, and thus political coordination. Large U.S., UK, and EU investment banks are new entrants into China's nascent bond sector, yet also retain long-standing presences pertaining to China's financial and economic development. Such factors should be weighed alongside other historical details in evaluating China's recent threats to, quote, dump U.S. Treasury bonds, end quote, as well as to ultimately view any sense of symbiosis which the U.S. and China are serving and why. Are banks such as J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, Standard Chartered, BNP Paribas, Deutsche Bank, and others necessarily against a quote-unquote bond run and wider trashing of U.S. debt? Or not so much? Who benefits? More specifically, who profits? Yet, given that ornate history, what accounts for the existing and growing animosities between Washington and Beijing? Is there a genuine sense of rivalry or enmity? Or is there rather a perennial partnership and codependency between the two super-economic powers? Are both poles existing concurrently due to the nature of a wider power dialectic? In this episode of Money and Fear, we'll review some monetary and political history involving Wall Street and Beijing in order to weigh the mentioned factors. Details not shared, let alone analyzed, by mainstream corporate business press supposedly reporting on U.S.-China trade, tariffs, and/or currency wars even. If you're not a Newsbud member yet, please join and tell others. It costs practically nothing, yet gives you information you're not supposed to know, thus empowering you to stay ahead of the herd and think like the establishment planners think.
I'm Wendy O'Neill, and I'm a trustee of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The family's biggest gift in China was to Peking Union Medical College in 1917 to found a center of excellence for medical education in China. The impact that that gift by the Rockefeller family had made on Chinese society, many of the most prominent doctors and medical university leaders and leaders in the Ministry of Health came through Peking Union Medical College. As we were starting our program at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, I realized that we had a huge challenge in front of us to be able to match what Peking Union Medical College had accomplished. And it made me very proud of our tradition in China and hopeful that we could accomplish a lot in the future. I studied East Asian Studies as an undergraduate, and I have a master's degree in Chinese history, and I lived in Hong Kong for 12 years and Beijing for 3. So I have a deep sense of Chinese culture and a deep respect for Chinese culture. And I think increasingly the problems around the world are international. They're issues of people migration, of environmental issues that transcend borders. And I think it's very important as an American organization that we don't treat China like the United States, that we recognized that it's a different culture, it has a different way of solving its issues, and we have to learn to work with the people to solve the problems.
I'm Richard Rockefeller. I'm chair of the board of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The sentiments that my grandfather and grandmother and actually other relatives of that generation had for China, very positive feelings for the country, passed through the generations to all of us. So China, in a way, wasn't such an unfamiliar place to us as it might have felt for a lot of Americans. The board of Rockefeller Brothers Fund took a trip to China in 2007. We did that because our China program, although it was still new, had been there for long enough to really make important contacts and establish a program in China, and it was time for the board to go and see firsthand what that was all about. What I did come away with was a sense of the extraordinary dynamism of the people that we met in China in general. I was extremely impressed by the determination to do something about, in particular, the environmental problems that China faces. At all levels, this was true, and it was reflected not just in what people said, but what I learned about the policies that they're enacting. When it comes to southern China, RBF focuses its programmatic interests in the environment, dealing with both civil society and the government, we've had to learn quite a lot about what is acceptable and what works well in China. While in the process of trying to achieve those ends, I think that our other ends to make a more just and peaceful world are also served.
I'm Stephen Heinz, the president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The fund was involved in grant making in Asia for many, many years, really going back to the beginning of the foundation's work. But we came to the conclusion that we were spread too thin over too much geography to really have deep impact. So we looked for places that we thought of having pivotal significance, places that if you really could make progress in, you could really change conditions in the world. And we ended up choosing southern China because we see China as perhaps the most important story of the 21st century. As we looked more deeply at China and its development, one of the interesting things that you see in Chinese history, both modern and ancient, is that much of the change in China actually starts in the South. The South is a place of innovation, of experimentation, and it's there that a lot of the ideas that ultimately become part of China's national policy or national direction start. The mission of the fund guides the work that we do everywhere, and in fact we were drawn to China precisely because of our mission, which is about creating a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world. And if you look at China, those questions of justice, sustainability, and peace are critical to China's path of development in the 21st century. If it develops in a sustainable and peaceful way that also brings justice to its people, it will be a remarkable success story and good for the entire planet.
My name is Shanu Belsky, and I'm the Program Director for Southern China at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. When we say Southern China, we actually are talking about a quite large geography, which includes 9 provinces. In the last 30 years, China has gone through really rapid economic development. These changes are also extremely visual. Forests of buildings have come up, and factories after factories have been built. And actually, this particular area is also called the factory of the world. The economic reforms in China have, first of all, brought a lot of benefits for the people of China. It has helped to lift hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty. However, unfortunately, much of this progress has come at the cost of the environment, because the speed of change and speed of industrialization, speed of urbanization is so rapid. You know, people's health being affected all over the place. And so this is an area actually we have chosen to focus on. Some of our grantees are doing extremely creative work, finding very innovative ways to break new ground to try to contribute to solving some of these environmental problems.
The Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs was an environmental group set up in the year 2006. Our first project is to build a national pollution database. The reason that we decided to start it with environmental transparency, we believe that the real barrier to China's pollution control is not the lack of technology or money, it is the lack of motivation. So to promote motivation, we need to supplement the weak enforcement in China through public participation. The Land and Resources and Ministry of Information, they've been disclosing all this information, and we put it together through a user-friendly database, which we put online and make it more accessible. Our database covers the entire China. You know, we provide people access to pollution data, the environmental quality data, the amount of discharge, and a list of violators of environmental laws and standards in all the 31 provinces and 300 cities. What we found is that when people access this information, some of the polluters who used to pay fines year after year without solving their problem, started feeling the pressure. At this moment, more than 50 of them successfully removed their records from the so-called blacklist. Some of the largest corporations in the world have become the active users of this database. They include Walmart, GE, Nike. They are comparing their list of suppliers with our list of violators. When they identify problems, they will contact with them and push those polluters to take corrective action. It generated some motivation for some of the polluters to change their behavior and comply with the Chinese legal standards.
The Natural Resources Defense Council works on a wide range of areas in China, including climate change, energy efficiency, green buildings, environmental health, law and governance, and green supply chain issues. So China has some of the biggest and the fastest moving environmental challenges in the world. And Chinese government and Chinese society are very interested in learning from international experience, and in particular from the type of work that NRDC does in the US. Thanks to the support of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, we've been able to implement an in-depth on-the-ground study in Yunnan province in the area of environmental governance. So how is China identifying environmental health challenges, and then how do they work through the system to reduce the health risks created by those? We've also worked on environmental transparency issues. We think that access to information is fundamental. The government selected a site in a lead mining and smelting region in northeast Yunnan province. And we spent a good amount of time going down to the local level, interviewing government officials, talking with the companies. And though there was a very serious lead and heavy metal pollution risk, the government did not have a very strong system for identifying the problem. Our principal goals are to deepen the work we're doing in all areas in climate, energy efficiency, environmental health and governance, and in greening of supply chains. A lot of it just takes time working with the best local Chinese partners and to just kind of push forward. Yes, it's not easy, but I think it's, there's a lot of great opportunities to improve things here.
Now to talk about investing in China and his latest venture, weather central here as well. So Evelyn, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I just want to get your views on how things have evolved. Has it become a more open society? Has it become an easier place to do business?
Oh, I think it is, no doubt. I think it's a remarkable country. When you think of what has happened in the last 10 years, let alone 20 years, is an achievement beyond recognition.
I'm Richard Rockefeller. I'm chair of the board of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The sentiments that my grandfather and grandmother and actually other relatives of that generation had for China, very positive feelings for the country, passed through the generations to all of us. So China, in a way, wasn't such an unfamiliar place to us as it might have felt for a lot of Americans.
What sort of a financial deal should Obama be seeking to strike when he travels to China next month?
No, I think this would be the time, because you really need to bring China into the creation of a new world order, financial world order.
So Evelyn, what about the RMB situation? You mentioned a so-called currency problem. I mean, do you see the day in the next 5 years where it's fully convertible and flexible?
Well, you're talking to a person who's quite old. If I'm around in 5 years, I'd like to think that that is the case. I think we've all got to move towards that opportunity, and I think the challenge also is whether we should move towards an international currency.
But they really are issues of the construction of a new world order. That's what this is about. And that's the sort of dialogue the Chinese are generally good at. And so a partnership between us is essential. A conflict between us is going to exhaust us both in tactical exercises that cannot be conclusive.
And the New World Order could satisfy both.
It has to satisfy both, because otherwise it will lead to tensions that will exhaust us both.
One has to give credit to President Nixon's and Henry Kissinger's initiative. They broke the ice. They did. But they confronted a residue of suspicion, and that suspicion was mutual, and grievances, and they were also mutual, that it really took time for the relationship to sort of become more normal, more predictable, and eventually what we accomplished was that it became, in fact, open and full, comprehensive, and in fact initiated a kind of secret collaboration, or even perhaps you could call it an alliance.